Welcome to the Triangle Apologetics Community February 2025 meeting. We are a group of men and women from diverse age groups, backgrounds, and levels of education who are interested in scientific research and general evidence that point to God's existence, character, and the Bible's reliability. Our topics lean toward STEM areas of interest, but are not limited to these. Our email address is on the screen there at triangle-apologetics-community@outlook.com. So here's a list of our upcoming schedule for February through April of this year. Tonight, of course, the February meeting, Reverse Engineering, a Philosophy of Exploration and Creative Problem Solving by Dominic Halsmer. Next month in March, we have Christianity and Critical Race Theory with Neil Shenvi. And then in April, we have From the Biggest to the Smallest in the Universe, Michael Strauss, who has presented to this group before. Okay, let's talk about tonight's agenda. Tonight we have Reverse Engineering, a Philosophy of Exploration and Creative Problem Solving by Dominic Halsmer, PhD. On the right side of the screen there you can see the cover for his book Hacking the Cosmos, How Reverse Engineering Uncovers Organization, Ingenuity, and the Care of a Maker. What has Stuttgart to do with Jerusalem? How does the field of engineering interact with theology to inform the science and spirituality conversation? A reverse engineering approach to nature with a focus on layers of enabling relationships, known as nested affordances, draws from all pertinent areas of knowledge to illuminate the big questions about origins, meaning, and purpose. Interwoven personal stories highlight the author's colorful journey to this perspective and demonstrate the applicability of such an approach. Could a relational view of nature help make sense of some of the more challenging aspects of the human condition? Find inspiration through study of the intricate organization of our fascinating cosmos. It speaks of an ingenious plan, not only for our existence, but also to invite us into the ultimate relationship with the loving Mastermind who is engineering it all for our benefit. Dominic Halsmer is the former Dean of the College of Science and Engineering at Oral Roberts University. He now serves as the Director of the Center for Faith and Learning at ORU. He has been teaching science and engineering courses at ORU for 24 years and is a registered professional engineer in the state of Oklahoma. He received his bachelor's and master's degree in aeronautical and astronautical engineering from Purdue University in 1985 and 1986, respectively. He earned a PhD in mechanical engineering from UCLA in 1992 and an MA in biblical literature from Oral Roberts University in 2013. His current research interests involve the integration of faith and learning, contributions from the field of engineering to the current science theology discussion, reverse engineering of complex natural systems, and the preparation of scientists and engineers for missions work within the technical communities. There we go. All right, I'm going to stop my share, and Dominic, it's all yours. If you want to share your screen, we can go from there. All right, I think we're good.
Reverse Engineering, a Philosophy of Exploration and Creative Problem Solving, or, as the title of my book says, Hacking the Cosmos, How Reverse Engineering Uncovers Organization, Ingenuity, and the Care of a Maker. And I appreciate that fine introduction, Dennis. I got a chance to hear the president of ASME speak a few years back, and he said something interesting that caught my attention. He said, some people are thinkers. Some people are doers. Some people are both. We call them engineers.
Yes, I love
it. He might be a little bit biased, but it got me thinking about the way engineers work. And a lot of times they do forward engineering where they really are engaged in doing something. They're designing and building something new. They're creating something new. But a lot of times they are thinkers in terms of something already exists and they need to analyze it. They need to understand how it works. They need to dissect it and take it apart. And really what they're doing there is not forward engineering, but reverse engineering. And maybe some of you are familiar with this term. I teach a course called Machines and Mechanisms here at ORU, and I use this book by Robert Norton, Design of Machinery. And interestingly, in this book, it bounces back and forth between synthesizing and creating a design, which we call forward engineering. And then that's where you're thinking about something and then you do it. But then it goes to other areas in this textbook where it talks about where you're just making an observation and analyzing an existing design. And here's where you're doing reverse engineering, where something has been done and now you're thinking about it and analyzing it and trying to quantify or answer some questions about, what was in the mind of the original engineer when they did this. You ever thought about that? And so I've been working with several students here at ORU on some of this research and seeing how it impacts a Christian worldview. And they really have helped me a lot. And about 5 years ago, we got together and we kind of codified all of this research in a book called Hacking the Cosmos. And in particular, we look at something called affordance-based reverse engineering, and we'll get into that term affordance here in more detail, but simply I can tell you it's just a relationship that contributes to a capability that we as conscious agents have. For example, the chair you're sitting in, you have a relationship with that chair that affords sitting. We call that affordance, maybe sittability. It's been designed into the chair specifically for a human of your size. And we look at this application to artificial human-made systems, but also we're going to take a look at how it would apply to natural systems and what are the philosophical implications of that to natural systems. One of my wife's favorite television shows was NCIS, and here, this is an interesting show because they do a lot of reverse engineering, but they don't call it that. Basically, they explore relationships that led to events. They uncover the planning, the organization, and the ingenuity when they try to get inside the mind of the original perpetrator of these criminal events or the engineer. And so CSI, you could also think of that as cosmic scene investigation for hacking the cosmos. And a very famous example of reverse engineering also is Sherlock Holmes. And Arthur Conan Doyle wrote the complete works of Sherlock Holmes, which I read a few years ago. Really interesting stuff. I don't know if any of you have ever read the complete works of Sherlock Holmes or any of his stories?
Some of them.
Yeah.
Some stories, not the complete ones.
By the way, I meant to mention at the beginning of this, we've got such a small group tonight. What do we got, about 10 people or so?
Yes.
We've got such a small group. Don't hesitate to jump in at any point and interrupt me and ask a question or make a comment. As long as it's not, a 10-minute long comment. But yeah, I'm happy to have dialogue on this, even in the midst of the presentation. So there's actually several slides here on reverse engineering with regard to Sherlock Holmes and his views of it. But actually, I'm going to skip over a lot of this because if we have time, we can come back to it. But I want to get further along before we do that. If you want to know more about this, you can look in the Chuck Bockel edited a book on mechanical engineering education handbook, where there's a chapter in that book by some students and myself where we talk more about this reverse engineering. But I do want to tell you this story about reverse engineering. Maybe you've heard it before, but towards the end of World War II, a couple of B-29 superfortresses, which were the newest American bomber, went down off the Aleutian Islands into Siberia, and the Russians got a hold of them, and they never gave them back. They took those planes apart piece by piece and dissected them, analyzed them, and came up with their own version, the Tu-4 Bear bomber. And it was funny, in the Paris Air Show in 1946 or 47, the U.S. Personnel saw this Russian bomber come in and it's like, wait a minute, that's a B-29. But we kind of got back at the Russians when we realized they did such a good job of reverse engineering the B-29 that the Tu-4 Bear bomber's engines tended to overheat and catch fire, just like the American version. William Harvey, who discovered blood circulation, he was thinking like a reverse engineer when he discovered and postulated this idea of veins and arteries in the human body that flow and circulate blood. it's an interesting history lesson to go back and read his thought processes as he was discovering this. Even Leonardo da Vinci, back in the 14 and 1500s, was one of the first reverse engineers of natural systems. And he said something really interesting that I like. He said, the human foot is a masterpiece of engineering and a work of art. Galen of Pergamon was a famous reverse engineer, even in the 2nd century. He used to dissect gladiators when they would come out of the games after they had been killed, and could apply reverse engineering to these living structures and try to understand them better. Even and in this book by Messler on reverse engineering, he goes all the way back to the ancient Egyptians, who gave some indication that they were listening to what the pyramids were saying as they were building them. This relationship between what's being built and the engineers and the users of the designed objects was important to them even way back then. They talk about how a crack was opening up in one of the chambers, and they realized that the pyramid was trying to say something to them because the structure was not holding where it was supposed to be. But what is this idea of an affordance-based reverse engineering approach? So let's look at this term affordances and see if we can understand more about it. Jonathan Meyer was a professor at Clemson when he wrote the book on affordance-based design. And now he is at Anderson University, a Christian university down in South Carolina. And we are currently collaborating on a new chapter for a book right now. He proposed that the concept of affordance, that is a relationship that provides something to the end user, or it could be a part-to-part affordance where it ultimately provides an end user affordance or something to an end user. And this is an underlying and unifying principle in the science of product design and reverse engineering. Well, the fact that engineers create affordances, and the fact that we see so many affordances, so many value-producing, value-enhancing affordances in our universe, in natural systems, leads to the reasonable hypothesis that the universe is perhaps an engineered system. So I would suggest that everybody should explore this possibility, because it's crying out for explanation when you look at it. An example of an affordance structure matrix for a robotic vacuum cleaner is here. And this is what Meyer suggested as a good way to reverse engineer a product like this is to list all of the elements of the product. Here you have battery and all the different elements of this robotic vacuum cleaner. And then on this side, on the horizontal side, you list all the positive and negative affordances. Affordances can be positive or negative. And then as you go through and see which elements lead to which affordances, it leads to a better understanding of any device. But where'd this idea of affordances come from? Well, it came from ecological psychology. Kurt Kafka is a Gestalt psychologist who introduced this idea of an affordance being this capability that a creature has by virtue of its relationship to its environment. Okay, so actually we're getting to the class participation part of this presentation. So if you would all unmute yourselves, I've got some questions for you to answer. Kafka writes that affordances are directly perceived in nature. And he says, things, quote, tell us what to do with them. Each thing says what it is. A fruit says, what does a fruit say?
Eat me. Eat me.
That's right. That's right. Eat me. Water says,
Drink me.
drink me. Thunder says,
Hide from me.
fear me. Very good. And woman says, love me. Isn't that a great quote?
So be careful.
I know. It's well, you have to understand he was a male, white male in the early 20th century. So, but I think it's a very interesting quote. And it's talking about affordances here, how we perceive these relationships that we have in nature. And if the engineer has done a good job with them, then we kind of know what to do with them. Of course, in the 21st century here, we need a gender neutral update to this. Everyone says, love me, don't they?
Yes. Yes.
Proverbs 19:22 says, what a person desires is unfailing love. And this has led me to believe through all of my studies on affordances that love is the ultimate of all of the affordances. We have this option. We can love, or, you don't have to, but you have that option. Can you see the title all right, or is that blocked by something here?
We can see it here.
You can see it okay? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, James Gibson was an ecological psychologist who really took this idea and ran with it. And he says that the affordances are directly perceived in nature. And his wife also was a psychologist. Eleanor Gibson said learning about affordances entails exploratory activities. And so when we see these relationships in nature, we're intrigued by them. And this is, I think, how God has given us this penchant for truth seeking in nature. We want to know how things work. And so we explore things. And when we explore nature, you know who we discover? We discover the maker. Donald Norman wrote a book called The Design of Everyday Things. And in his book, he talks about how an affordance is a relationship between the properties of an object and the capabilities of the agent that determines just how the object could possibly be used. He also says that affordance provides strong clues as to the operations of things. And I thought that was significant, especially the way God has put clues into the universe to lead to knowledge of himself. Donald Norman also talks about signifiers. Good design requires good communication of the purpose, structure, and operation of the device to the people who will use it. That is the role of the signifier. For Norman, the term signifier refers to any perceivable indicator that communicates appropriate behavior to that person. I grew up on an airport, and the windsock was a very helpful device on a windy day as to whether you could go out and fly your lightweight Cessna 150 or not. If that windsock was pushing straight out, it indicated a strong wind. That was a signifier of appropriate behavior. Just like in us, we have this sense of right and wrong. C.S. Lewis talks about how everyone has this very similar sense of right and wrong. And this is an indicator to us of appropriate behavior. And where does that come from? It's a really good question. William Gaver writes about, in his computer engineering studies, writes about how sequential affordances explain how affordances can be revealed over time, and nested affordances describe affordances that are grouped in space in a certain way. And the role of a good interface between engineered systems and users is to guide attention via well-designed groups of sequential and nested affordances. And I think this is what happens in nature with regard to us and our maker. God has given us these nested affordances through space and time that lead to a knowledge of him. These interdependent affordances not only reflect good design, but also provide important clues for reverse engineering or understanding what was in the mind of the original engineer. Affordances exhibit complementarity. I mentioned earlier that chairs afford sitting if they're designed well. If they're designed in a different way, they can afford stacking so that these items are complementary with each other. I mentioned earlier that there's positive and negative affordances. There's thousands of affordances on your smartphone. But there's some negative affordances with regard to smartphones, like distractibility when driving. Affordances lend insight into what the engineer was thinking. And you can begin to see back into the mind of the original engineer, their intentions, their abilities, and perhaps the constraints under which they labored. Look at Jeremiah 9:7. Have you ever noticed this? God is saying here, see, I will refine and test them, speaking of his people. Or what else can I do because of the sin of my people? That's such an interesting statement coming from the creator of the universe. Is it possible that free will beings such as ourselves have, in a way, in a sense, kind of constrained God's what God can do? I mean, I hate to say that God's not all powerful. I think he is. But, there are some things that God cannot do. God cannot lie. God is love. And so he acts always within a loving way, and that gives freedom. And so it makes for an interesting situation when you have rebellious free will creatures, huh?
Yes.
There was a really good paper that came out by a biology researcher and an engineer on the heat shock mechanism for E. coli. It's in this article out of Stanford University called Understanding Biology by Reverse Engineering the Control. And so they made a mathematical model and a computer model of the E. coli heat shock mechanism. And they did some different things by eliminating pathways. Have you heard of this technique known as subtract and operate? Anybody ever heard of that?
No.
It's very simple. You take a piece away from the system and you see if it still works. If it still works, does it work as well as it used to work? When you were a kid, maybe you pulled a leg off of a daddy long leg spider and then put him down to see if he could still walk. That's not a very nice example, but that's subtract and operate. You know what they discovered and concluded from this? The E. coli, this simulation shows robust and efficiently afforded, shows that robustness and efficiency are afforded by all of these different information pathways, even in this simple bacteria. And they concluded this is what a well-trained control engineer would design. Yeah, this is an example of the subtract and operate technique in reverse engineering. This is talked about in the book by Otto and Wood on product design. And what struck me as I was starting to study and learn about this was that it's a relational theory of design. And that's interesting because I don't know if you've heard, but thinkers today, scientists, even philosophers, engineers, they're coming to realize that it's not so much what's in the universe that makes it so interesting, but it's the relationships between the things in the universe that make it so interesting. I mean, when you think about it, the fact that we have all of these interesting relationships between things, like the chemical elements, the atoms that make up our periodic table, such interesting relationships between those atoms have produced every complex thing in the universe. And so Meyer suggests that we need to try to untangle this relationship netting or webbing that exists between designers, users, and artifacts. And he proposes that an affordance-based method for reverse engineering and redesign would be the best way to do it. And so here is what he calls the big picture of design. There's three, I want you to focus on just the three entities in the middle here. The artifact, or that which is designed, the designer up here on the top, the user of the artifact. And so in the big picture of design, you have these three main entities. And for any device, you can imagine, the device is the artifact, and then whoever designed it and whoever they designed it for. And there's interesting relationships between all three of those entities. Well, we propose that in the big picture of reverse engineering, there's 4 entities now. Yes, you have the artifact, the designer, and the user of the artifact, but now you've got a 4th entity, the reverse engineer or the investigator. Maybe this artifact is a historical device that has long been hidden or recently discovered. And so you can imagine that way back when it had some designer and it even had some users, but now just recently it's been uncovered. Something like the Antikythera mechanism. I don't know if you've heard of that, but that was discovered in a shipwreck, and they didn't know what it was for 100 years, but they studied it, finally realized it was an astrolabe, a simulation of the heavens. That's thought to have been perhaps designed by Archimedes himself back near the 100 BC time. But anyway, these affordances between all of these elements are also key to capturing important interactions during reverse engineering studies. Oh, here's the Antikythera mechanism right here. So if we apply this, it looks like this. Anybody ever heard of the Antikythera mechanism? You read about that? Yeah, there's a great book out called Decoding the Heavens by Joe Marchant. It's one of the coolest reverse engineering books there is. And it talks about how this was found in this shipwreck, and then through curiosity and fascination, and the 20th century and scientists were the investigators, but the users were ancient students of the cosmos, and the engineer perhaps was Archimedes himself. And you can look at all the different relationships that exist between all of these entities, and it makes for a better understanding of the big picture of reverse engineering here. For example, there was a large time gap from when it was recently discovered to when it was actually used. The specimen was heavily corroded, but that doesn't mean you can't eventually uncover a pristine version of it, which they now have. And it was surprisingly advanced for its day. Here's another example. The RQ-170 was a drone that went down during the time when we were in Iraq, and it went down in Iran, and the Iranians captured it. And here, if you think about the engineer, it was Lockheed Martin. The user was the US Air Force or maybe the CIA. Here's the drone itself. And the investigators were Ahmadinejad or his scientists in Iran there who were trying to reverse engineer it and produce their own version of it. And so you have operational knowledge of the device by the Air Force. You have intimate knowledge of the device by the Lockheed Martin company. You have customer relations between Lockheed and the Air Force, mostly adversarial and distant or silent between the Martin group and the Air Force and the Iranians, but much curiosity by the Iranians. So this is what we mean by all these relationships. And the environment for this reverse engineering approach was one of distrust, cross purposes, defensiveness, suspicion, and fear. So I'm not sure how successful the Iranians ever were with it. I don't know, maybe you know more about this story than I do, but I do know that Lockheed Martin was smart enough to encode and encrypt the software on the CPU inside this aircraft so that it made it very difficult for the Iranians to reverse engineer that software. And I got to thinking, it's interesting when you think about us as humans being technology that God has created, and that God, if Lockheed Martin was smart enough to encrypt their software in case their technology fell into enemy hands, then surely God was smart enough in case his technology, that is human beings, were to fall into enemy hands, that he would provide a means of rescue and redemption. And I think that's exactly what he did through the person of Jesus Christ.
Good stuff. Hey, a quick question.
Sure.
I just read, let me get back on camera. I just read in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, the reverse situation has just happened. An
What?
Iranian drone landed in Queens, New York, courtesy of some very special people operating between the Ukraine and here. And now the U.S. is reverse engineering, presumably, these drones that Iran makes. So
Really?
it didn't look like that. It was long and slender. But anyway, it's in the Wall Street Journal from yesterday. I think it was yesterday.
That's fascinating. I haven't seen that yet. I'll have to look that up.
Yeah. Anyway, that just very recent news.
I wonder if they got that drone from the Russians.
They absolutely got it from the Russians.
Yeah.
The Ukrainians got it from the Russians, who got it from the Iranians. Yes.
Yeah.
They can trace it back. They just had to go through some very special procedures to allow it to come to the U.S., where the U.S. government can now, analyze it or whatever they're going to do.
Uh-huh. Very
Anyway,
interesting.
that's all.
Well, up to this point, we've been talking about artificial systems, but what if we apply this approach to natural systems? I mean, think about this. Okay, first of all, let's think about what is the artifact. Let's call human life, or you could say just life in general. And so I have a DNA strand here as our artifact. And so I don't have a picture of God, but I do have, what's his name? Did you see Bruce Almighty?
Oh, yeah, I am. Morgan Freeman.
Yeah, Morgan Freeman. That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sure God has intimate knowledge of what he has made. We, as users of our own technology, of our bodies, you can think of our souls maybe as users of our bodies here, and that would make us end users in a way. But there's also another sense in which God is really the true end user, because hasn't he made all things for himself and for his glory? So you could think either way on that. But we as users would have an operational knowledge. But this kind of brings up the expectation for additional revelation, because we're born into this world, and we kind of have an operational knowledge. Heck, before we're even 1 year old, we've solved the inverted pendulum problem because we begin to walk, and that's pretty cool. But we really don't know very much about what we're supposed to be doing. And so this actually is good rationale for expecting something like the Bible, which is additional revelation, not only in written form, but in flesh, that God would come in the flesh and perform teaching and a rescue for all of us. So investigators would be the ones who are curious enough and humble enough and have an appreciation of the natural systems to really wonder how they work and what it's all about. And so this is the big picture of reverse engineering when it comes to a natural system like living systems. You see interesting things coming about all the time in science. Hugh Ross is one of the most prolific people I know who have kept such a close eye on what science is coming up with, and have brought it to light to help us understand from a Christian worldview the implications of it. Something like epigenetics, that the idea that you have connections between behavior and people's state of health. This is really an interesting topic. It kind of makes me think of how, the sins of the fathers will be visited on the offspring, and the good behavior will be passed on for future generations as well. The environment here is one of limited knowledge of reality, and then we also have, everyone has this sense of brokenness and not being able to live up to what nature seems to be calling us into. But we also sense this adversarial influence, this influence of evil in the world. And so all of this kind of colors our understanding of the big picture of reverse engineering of natural systems. So if you look at something like, when I said a nested hierarchy of relationships here, you could start out at the level of like atoms or subatomic particles, and those connections or relationships between subatomic particles afford atoms. Atoms relate to each other in a way that affords molecules. Molecules relate to each other and other atoms in a way that ultimately leads to biomolecules, molecules that are precursors to life. And this leads to things like amino acids, which affords proteins and DNA, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you think about each one of these arrows being additional affordances, you ultimately get to something as complex as the human body. And this is just incredible when you think about it, that this could possibly come about by accident. I mean, I hate to say come about. Some people would say come about at random, but actually I don't like that phrase, because I'd rather say by accident, because even human engineers will create a system sometimes, and they'll use random processes in creating something. Random number generators are used in different engineering endeavors, and so maybe God did use randomness at some points throughout all of this, but certainly didn't occur by accident. Here's another nested hierarchy of affordances. Consider the path by which God brings us our daily bread. We have this huge fireball at a certain distance away from the earth, which sends photons. And this relates to us through heat and light and the seasons. We get vitamin D through the sun. We have green plants that form the basis for our entire ecosystem through photosynthesis. And then this creates chemical energy in plants so that they grow and mature, and they produce carbon dioxide. They produce oxygen, we produce carbon dioxide, so it's a win-win situation. Food for animals, food for us, and life and love, the ultimate affordance. When I read some of the literature coming out of the ecological psychology arena, I was kind of dumbfounded and stunned by the way they were talking. This researcher, Rob Withigan, says, when actively exploring the environment, the agent is attracted or repelled by some of its affordances, and the ensuing behavior is partly the result of these invitations. He's talking about how affordances invite certain behavior. And I just couldn't help but think that God has designed the universe to invite us into these life-giving, vital relationships with himself. So here's the emerging picture. It suggests multiple purposes of the maker. Number one, the cosmos affords the emergence of intelligent life that is capable of knowing its maker. Number two, the cosmos provides knowledge of the maker through affordances that demonstrate ingenuity, wisdom, and loving care. Three, the cosmos has been engineered to invite us into an everlasting loving relationship with our maker through the work of Jesus Christ, who makes that possible. Four, the challenging aspects of the human condition provide important opportunities for us to learn truth in a redemptive environment and grow stronger in our love for others and our love for God. And have you ever thought about this? Perhaps the fall of mankind and the resulting corruption are an example of a divine subtract and operate demonstration. Because what happened when Adam and Eve sinned? They lost their presence of God in their life and in the garden and in the world. God had to, in a sense, kind of remove himself from the picture. And what happened? A very, very difficult part of history where, it talks about when Noah was building the ark, only evil was in the hearts of men all the time. That's all they wanted to do was evil. That's a very tough passage of scripture. I mean, it makes me ask the question, is God a bad engineer? If his creations have just all gone bad? And I often wondered, that's a question I still have. But when I was writing this book, I kind of came to this conclusion. Perhaps God was wanting to demonstrate for us our need for a relationship, this vitally important relationship with him. Because when he is removed from the picture, everything goes to hell in a handbasket. And it's only through his loving kindness and his grace and with the people of Israel throughout the Old Testament that he was able to sustain human beings and eventually bring about a rescue. So that's what my perspective is on the fall of mankind, I think. Well, I'm going to close with Acts 14:17. It's almost time to plant onions. I'm going to plant my vegetable garden here in a few weeks, and I'll be loving it when those tomatoes are coming ripe. See, God has not left himself without testimony. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their seasons. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy. So what do you think? Do you have any questions?
Very cool. Well, I'll make a comment. I'm leaning over because our big screen is off to the side there. I spent 40 years in IT, including writing software and running hardware and all this stuff. And this all makes perfect sense to me. It's like, oh yeah, I used to reverse engineer software. I mean, it, but it's interesting, just the whole discussion about the relationships. The relationships of in the cosmos. If you've gone through Hugh Ross's book Design to the Core, you see all these relationships at every level.
Yeah.
From the supergalactic clusters all the way down to what's in the Earth and everything. But that's really interesting how this whole concept talks about it's really the relationships that really make it interesting. And then you have to say, well, why are the relationships there, and how did they get there? So
exactly.
This is all great stuff.
That gets at the core of the definition of ingenuity.
Yes.
If you've ever looked up the definition of ingenuity, it has to do with arranging things and relating things in such a way that they cleverly solve a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why that's one of the key phrases in the subtitle of my book, Hacking the Cosmos, is that we see ingenuity in the creation, in nature.
Yes, yes.
Yes, very interesting presentation, Dr. Halsmer. I enjoyed it very much. And I got thinking, God being God, from an engineering perspective, especially that you had there. I have an engineering degree. I was a practicing civil engineer for a time. But if you think of God, the ultimate engineer, everything has a purpose in the engineering world, right? Everything has design, every component has a purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And what you mentioned there about the fall of mankind sometimes seems purposeless to us. It's like, why did he allow this thing to happen? If he was in control of all of it, why did he allow it to happen? And so if he is the ultimate engineer, then we have to accept and know that he has a purpose in all of it, every component, the interactions of everything that's going on in our world,
right?
Purposeful, even if we're not see it. So I love your engineering perspective on that. It's just quite interesting.
I find that when I focus on the amazing ingenuity in the creation, it bolsters my faith and my trust. Like you said, that God knows what he's doing. And even Paul writes about that. I think it's Thessalonians, where he talks about all this is evidence. And he's actually talking about how their faith is, the faith of the Thessalonians is growing in the midst of trials and tribulations. And he says, all this is evidence that God's calculations are correct. That's my paraphrase, but that God knows what he's doing. And I thought that was interesting, the way that Paul pointed that out.
Yeah, and again, just to continue the analogy, the millions and millions of variables that there are in the world, in our lives, and the things, the interactions between us all, God keeps track of all those variables somehow, and he's working equations that are going to work for the good ultimately, right? Even if it seems to us they're nonsensical right now. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
amazing, amazing intelligence at that level is just far beyond us.
One of the things one of the RTB, they did a podcast, I think it was, this was maybe a year or so ago. Fuzz Rana was on it with um, Jeff Zwernick, and
Uh-huh.
they were talking about these. How so I'm a computer guy, so as soon as they start talking about error recovery code, I'm going, oh yeah, of course you have to have error recovery code. They were talking about how DNA itself has error recovery code. So when
Yeah.
they to replicate, there's some redundancy backup kind of stuff in there, error correcting basically, similar to what we see in ECC code in the computer.
Mhm.
And it's like how not only is there the DNA that has the instructions, but it has error correcting code in it. I mean, you don't get that by accident.
No, no.
Yeah, and I like what's happening now. All the atheist crowd was talking about junk DNA years ago. Remember that junk DNA? Because
Uh-huh.
we found DNA strands. It appears to have no purpose. How would a good designer design something with a bunch of junk in it that has no purpose? And of course, now they're finding out actually all of that so-called junk DNA has a purpose, and we're just uncovering it now.
Yep,
Just trying to
yep.
beginning
Hmm.
to understand it actually.
I've been following that discussion.
Hmm.
Well, the new is the appendix and
Oh,
its purpose.
yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, same thing. They used to take people's appendixes out. They used to take people's tonsils out, right? And then they figured out, hey, gee, actually, these things do have a purpose, right?
Yeah, yeah.
They're all.
Yeah. I still have mine.
So,
I think my dad, they took his out, in that day.
Hmm.
so maybe we have a little time to go back to Sherlock Holmes, but I'm curious about the robotic vacuum cleaner and the red and green squares. That was
Oh, yeah. You've got positive and negative affordances there. A vacuum cleaner might be noisy, too noisy. People don't want to use it, so that would be a negative affordance. It might cause electric shock if you don't handle it properly, or it could cause injury if you stick your finger in the wrong place or something. So there's negative affordances as well as positive affordances. And what engineers are doing affordance-based design is they try to maximize the number of positive affordances and the quality of those affordances and minimize the number of negative affordances and the impact of those negative affordances. So the affordance structure matrix just kind of helps you to think about all of those. And then if you, Jonathan Meyer says in his book, if you completely fill in the affordance structure matrix so that you see all of the relationships between all of the parts, then you've effectively reverse engineered an object.
well, the picture you included had it about to go underneath the couch, and so I was looking at the green and red, trying to teach the robot the difference between a chair leg and a wall.
Yeah. Yeah. Artificial intelligence, right?
Mhm.
One you might try to go around, and the other one, how many bumps do you have in rapid succession before you decide your circuits say wall, let's move on, or
Yeah.
leg, we can get in under.
Yeah, we have one that we use occasionally, and I've actually watched it for that, John, for that very purpose of how is it. So I see how it's determining that's a chair leg or or a pillar on a pillar, not a full wall. And yeah, how many times do you try and bump and move over a little bit more, and then you say, okay, well, there's too many. There's probably some program number that says if you do this operation, 6 times in a row and you can't pass, then it must be a wall or
Yeah.
some formula like that.
Yeah.
I have to say, I don't know, it's been a long time ago now, but there was some professor at Duke that suggested he was looking at patterns in nature, and he had a postulate that if you look at the branching structure of trees and compare it with the branching structure of river tributaries, that they are almost identical.
Uh-huh.
And so now when I'm driving down the road, I'm pondering tree limb structure, particularly in deciduous trees when you can see it.
Yeah.
But now I'm going to be looking up in the heavens and trying to see what purpose this or that might have.
Okay, so I got a question for you about these affordances. Speaking of the vacuum cleaner, reminded me of a funny video I saw once. But let me ask my question, and then I'll tell you the example after a question. So there are positive and there are negative affordances. Is there any room in that whole affordances sort of study of something that be more like a humorous affordance, or would that fall into the positive category?
Well, laughter is good medicine, right?
Yes.
I think God probably built humor into our lives for that purpose, for health. So
Mm-hmm.
I would say it's a positive affordance. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
What's the joke now, Dennis?
So you can look this up. It's all over YouTube, or yeah, it's on YouTube. So this family had their vacuum cleaner set to go off at certain times, and they had some cameras in the house, and they also had 2 dogs. And the one of the dogs, in full view of the camera on their nice hardwood floor, couldn't quite make it outside in time. And right about then, the Roomba starts going back and forth over the over the
Oh,
floor,
no.
and that was definitely a humorous but negative affordance.
Somehow I don't think they're going to be able to artificial intelligence their way out of that one.
Yeah.
You would need a few more sensors, I think.
Yeah. An olfactory sensor.
Yes, an olfactory, or there are sensors that will, yeah, detect certain chemicals in the air. So yeah, you'd have to really fine tune that one, but it could be done, but probably not in the current version.
I was just thinking about what the gentleman said there about repeating patterns. That's really quite interesting about the tree veins and then the tributaries and rivers sort of repeating patterns. And it led me to think, a lot of the evolutionary crowd will say, well, this, must have evolved from this because we've got the same design here and this, and that must have came from this. And well, maybe it's just a good design, and we're just
Yeah.
repeating this very good design, like the tree limbs and the tributaries. We're
Right.
just repeating that amongst different species. Doesn't mean one came from the other necessarily,
Right.
And so anyway.
But in my perspective, if one did come from the other, that's an even more ingenious design
Yeah,
in some ways.
Well,
repeat a
that's the whole
successful design.
Yeah, if you're a good engineer, you will use your basic design for multiple things. It makes perfect sense.
Right.
I've been reading a book recently by Rope Kahjonen, who is a Swedish philosopher and theologian in the intelligent design community. But he's written a book called The Compatibility of Evolution and Design. And he's been kind of taking some heat from other ID guys because he's saying, hey, look, even if you have this common ancestry where evolution has used these mechanisms, it's still a setup job. There's no way you can get this kind of biological evolution occurring unless it's all pre-programmed ahead of time to operate this way. And so he lays out this whole argument and really shows, I think, quite convincingly that the evolutionary story, at least not the evolutionary worldview, but the evolutionary scientific mechanism, is quite compatible with this idea that it was all designed.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, and I like both sides of the argument. I like to listen to the evolutionary arguments. I like to listen to the intelligent design arguments, and they're both very compelling. And it's not a settled issue yet. So I love that debate actually.
So you're saying that God was a student of Stephen Covey, begin with the end in mind?
Of course.
Well, I was just going to say that I think you're talking more about microevolution than macroevolution in that instance, correct?
Yeah, but even if you, there are some intelligent design folks who adhere with common ancestry, and Michael Behe, for example, believes in common ancestry. So even in that case, I don't think it excludes the possibility that God designed it all and used evolutionary processes in some ways that we just don't fully understand yet.
Yeah, but I think the key thing is if you use the word design or you use the word programmed, you're either directly or indirectly referring to a mind that engineered it, so to speak.
Right.
Which is the opposite of happened by accident.
Right.
Just a little side comment on the drone. I'm not sure if I got the story right, but I think they spoofed the GPS signal somehow because they figured out that was the weak link to the drone, and they were able to override the existing GPS and make it think it's landing in a U.S. base when it's actually landing in Iraq. Something like that. I think it's how they pulled that off.
Is that what happened? Okay.
So yeah, it was the GPS signal was the weak link they figured out. So
interesting.
I think that's how they did it.
I'll have to look up that
story though.
To the right page.
That book is available through Kendall Hunt Publishers up in Iowa. Okay. They have a website, kendallhunt.com.
There we go. And there's the cover there on the right.
Mm-hmm.
All right, then. Well, if there are no other questions, I want to say a big thank you to Dr. Halsmer here. This is great stuff. And this has got my mind really going now because this is like speaking my language here. This engineering, reverse engineering thing. And I love that your joke at the beginning about people who do and think, people who think, and then there are engineers who do both. Okay, well, let's
say just comment, Dr. Halsmer. I really enjoyed it, and I hope we can have a lot more people like you in the sciences and the engineering fields that are also Christians and have a good way to connect the two. It's the my passion. Kids go to college and they think they got to choose faith or science or faith in it.
Yeah, I came here a few decades ago to ORU, and I realized what a need there was for helping the students in a Christian university like this understand that they don't have to choose between the two. Mm-hmm. So I'm a kindred spirit with you in that regard.
I joined the American Scientific Association a year or two ago. If anyone's interested, that is a great place for this sort of thing. They got brilliant people there. One of the guys, and they're all Christians, so they're scientists and people in the sciences and engineers.
Yeah, I just stepped off the executive board for the ASA last year.
Okay.
I've been in there for 15 years or so. This coming summer, the meeting, their annual meeting is going to be at Colorado Christian University in Lakewood, Colorado.
I can't wait because it's 5 minutes from my house here. It's at Colorado Christian University.
Oh, is that where you're at?
Yeah, it's literally a 5-minute drive. It's going to be awesome.
Well, I will look for you. I will look for you.
To be there?
I'm hoping. I just submitted an abstract with a student and with Jonathan Meyer, the guy at Clemson who's now at Anderson University, that we're going to write a new chapter on this idea for a book that's coming out. And we're going to hopefully present it at that meeting in Colorado.
Oh, great. Well, I'll look for you. I'll be there. I can't wait.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, we used to live maybe slightly more than 5 minutes from there, but not too long. I know exactly where that is. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, it's a great organization. They had a presentation from the guy who developed the ChemCam on the Mars rover lander. You know, the laser would shoot a rock and vaporize
Uh-huh.
the rock and sniff the rock, and then it could see what the chemical components of the rock are.
I
He's a
saw
member
that
of that. He's a
presentation.
Christian. He's brilliant guy. So they got people like that in there.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.